The clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low murmur of the Hudson Valley ballroom. I stood, half hidden by a heavy velvet drape, watching the waitstaff glide past with trays of champagne and caviar. At the front of the room, Harrison Sterling adjusted his tuxedo cuffs and leaned into the microphone. He was a man who commanded boardrooms and terrified his competitors, and right now he was smiling. He was ready to introduce the video montage celebrating his son Richard's engagement to my younger sister Jessica. I checked my watch. 60 seconds. My name is Bonnie Jones. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 6 months, my family has painted me as a criminal. Every time I walked into a room, conversations dried up. My mother stopped taking my calls. My relatives looked at me like I was a disease they might catch. They tailored a story about a bitter, greedy sister and draped it over my shoulders. They told everyone in our upstate New York town that I used my professional skills to rob our own grandmother hours after her funeral. But they did not know I had spent those 6 months quietly unstitching every single lie. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not beg for their forgiveness. I gathered the receipts. In 1 minute, the 20-foot projection screens lowering from the ceiling would stop showing a fabricated romance and start showing the cold, hard truth. The heirloom sapphire they said I stole was about to become the weight that dragged my sister under. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I was not nervous. I was ready. Jessica sat at the head table, her hand resting on Richard's arm, her diamond engagement ring catching the chandelier light. She looked over the crowd with a smug, untouchable expression. She thought she had won. She thought the past was buried in a wall safe hours north of here. Before the lights dim and the truth comes out, let me take you back to where this nightmare started. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, take a second to subscribe to Linda Vengeance. Drop a comment telling me your age and if you have ever been blamed for something you did not do. It helps the channel more than you know. 6 months ago, the air in Grandma Rose's Victorian home in upstate New York was thick with the strange, quiet tension that always follows a funeral. The house smelled of lemon polish and stale lavender, a scent that used to mean summer vacations, but now just meant death and division. I stood in the wood-paneled study, my leather appraisal kit open on the desk. I built a quiet, successful career evaluating the remnants of other people's lives. I am an independent estate appraiser. I spend my days authenticating antiques, pricing vintage jewelry, and settling the physical ledgers of the deceased. Today I was supposed to catalog my own bloodline. My grandmother left behind an estate full of memories, but only one item truly mattered to the family trust: the Edwardian sapphire necklace. It was a piece held in the wall safe for 2 decades, untouched, unappraised, and heavily coveted. I slid the mahogany wall panel aside and spun the cold brass dial. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside sat a faded blue velvet box. I pulled it out, unsnapped the latch, and flipped the lid open. The velvet cushion was bare. There was only a faint indentation where the heavy stones used to rest. Before my brain could even process the empty space, the study door swung open. Jessica stood on the threshold. She was 3 years younger than me, but she had always treated life as a stage play where she was the undisputed lead. Her eyes dropped to the open safe, then to the empty box in my gloved hands. She did not gasp. She did not ask what happened or where it was. She simply raised her chin, her voice ringing out down the hallway, loud enough to ensure an audience. "I knew you would take it." My stomach dropped. "Jessica, the box is empty. It was empty when I opened the safe." Our mother Helen appeared in the doorway seconds later. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the door frame. "What is going on in here?" Jessica pointed a manicured finger at my appraisal tools resting on the mahogany desk. "The sapphire is gone. Bonnie took it. She is the only one who knows the combination. She is the only one who knows how to fence an antique like that without a paper trail. She used her kit to get into the safe before the lawyers even read the will." I set the velvet box down on the desk. The soft thud echoed in the quiet room. Mom, you cannot be serious. The safe was not forced. The necklace is missing. We need to call the police right now. To investigate you, Jessica countered. She stepped closer to our mother, linking her arm through Helen's. You have always looked down on us because of your firm. You wanted your cut first. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to shut down the absurdity of the claim. Helen looked at the empty safe, then at my professional jeweler's loop, and finally at me. Helen had always preferred Jessica's needy reliance over my quiet independence. It was easier to parent a child who always asked for help and money than one who paid her own rent at 18 and never looked back. Put your tools away, Bonnie, my mother said. Her voice was thin, devoid of any warmth. Mom, I did not take it. Leave the house keys on the desk, Helen continued. She would not meet my eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the floral rug beneath my boots. I think it is best if you step away from the estate. We will handle the inventory from here. The banishment was instant. There was no debate, no frantic search of the house, no benefit of the doubt. I zipped my leather case. The rasp of the metal zipper sounded unnaturally loud. I slung the strap over my shoulder and walked toward the door. As I passed them, my eyes caught the sleeve of Jessica's coat. It was a pristine, camel-colored cashmere wrap. I knew brands, I knew textiles, and I knew price tags. That coat retailed for $10,000. Jessica worked an entry-level administrative job and constantly complained about her credit card minimums. Standing a few feet behind them in the hallway was Aunt Valerie, my father's sister. She was a sharp, observant African-American woman who missed nothing. Valerie did not speak, but her dark eyes tracked my gaze from the empty safe to Jessica's expensive coat. Valerie gave me a slow, microscopic nod. She saw it too. I stopped in the doorway and looked Jessica dead in the eye. She stared back, a faint, triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She was daring me to say something. I did not say a word. I walked down the hall, out the front door, and into the cold New York air. The theft was a setup. The exile had just begun. But they made one crucial error. They accused an appraiser of theft without realizing I knew exactly how to track the true value of a lie. The silence was not immediate. It crept in like frost. I noticed it first on a Tuesday 4 days after the funeral. I walked into the local bakery on Main Street, a place I had visited every single week for 5 years, and the cashier would not meet my eyes. She handed me my coffee without a word. 2 women from my mother's garden club were sitting by the front window. They stopped talking the moment the brass bell above the door chimed. They stared at their scones until I walked out. By Friday, the digital erasure was finalized. I logged into my accounts to find I was removed from all the family group chats. The annual 4th of July barbecue invites went out across the neighborhood. My mailbox remained empty. Jessica was highly efficient. She did not just accuse me in the study. She took her story on tour. Upstate New York towns are fueled by old money and fresh gossip. Jessica fed them a narrative of the greedy, independent appraiser who leveraged her own grandmother's death for a quick payday. The lie spread faster than a grease fire. I spent my evenings authenticating 19th century pocket watches in my apartment. I kept the desk lamp bright. My hands were steady when I handled the delicate tweezers. But the moment I set them down, my fingers would tap a relentless, jagged rhythm against the wood. I was losing my family, and I could not even fight back because they refused to step into the ring. They preferred to starve me out. 3 weeks into the freeze, someone knocked on my door at 9 in the evening. I looked through the peephole. Aunt Valerie stood in the hallway holding a thick manila envelope. Valerie married my uncle 20 years ago. She was a corporate auditor who survived the ruthless culture of Manhattan finance before retiring upstate. She did not suffer fools, and she never engaged in the neighborhood gossip. I unlocked the deadbolt. Valerie walked past me, dropped the envelope on my kitchen island, and took a seat on the nearest stool. She looked around my apartment, taking in the neat rows of reference books and the jeweler's scales. They changed the locks on the Victorian, Valerie said. Her voice was smooth and devoid of pleasantries. Your mother hired a security firm. Jessica told them you might try to come back for the silver. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and slid one across the granite counter. I guess I should be flattered they think I am a master criminal. Valerie did not smile. She untwined the red string holding the envelope closed and slid a stack of bank statements onto the island. I do not think you are a criminal, Bonnie, but someone in that house is, and I prefer ledgers to rumors. I picked up the top sheet. It was a property lien record. I recognized the address immediately. It was my mother's house. I scanned the numbers, my appraisal training kicking in. The figures did not make sense. Helen took out a second mortgage, Valerie stated. She tapped the paper with her manicured fingernail. $200,000. The paperwork was finalized 5 weeks before Rose passed away. I stared at the black ink. My mother had inherited a comfortable life from my father. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and maintaining the illusion of effortless wealth. But Helen was terrible at math and even worse at impulse control. She believed keeping up appearances was a moral obligation. $200,000, I murmured, tracing the signature line. Where did the money go? That is the interesting part, Valerie replied. I checked the public records. She did not buy real estate. She did not buy a new car. The money just vanished into the ether. A week later, your grandmother's health declined rapidly. And now the most valuable liquid asset in the family trust is missing. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The puzzle pieces were rearranging themselves. Did my mother steal the sapphire? If Helen was drowning in a 6-figure debt she could not explain, the Edwardian necklace would be her perfect lifeboat. The stones alone could clear her ledger on the private market. And Jessica was always fiercely protective of Helen. If Jessica caught our mother taking the necklace, she would never turn her in. Instead, she would frame the daughter who already lived on the outside. She would frame me. For a moment, the theory held water. It explained my mother's inability to look me in the eye when she kicked me out. It explained why Jessica screamed so loudly before I even had a chance to speak. They were hiding a financial hemorrhage. I looked up at Valerie. My mother took it. Jessica is running interference to keep the trust attorneys from auditing Helen. Mallory took a slow sip of her water. The ice clinked against the glass. That is what I thought on Tuesday. It is a neat, logical theory, but it ignores a crucial variable. What variable? Valerie leaned forward, her dark eyes pinning me in place. The coat. I blinked, the image of the funeral flashing back, the crisp upstate air, the black umbrellas, and Jessica standing near the oak casket wearing a pristine camel-colored cashmere wrap. The coat, Valerie repeated. I spent 20 years auditing corporate fraud. The first rule of tracking stolen assets is watching how the suspect changes their lifestyle. Jessica works at a regional logistics firm. Her take-home pay barely covers her rent and her car lease. We both know this because Helen complains about supplementing her income every month. I nodded, following the thread. She wore a $10,000 piece of designer outerwear to bury our grandmother. Exactly, Valerie said. And I noticed her handbag. It was a limited edition designer piece. That is another $15,000 on the resale market. I ran a soft credit check on Jessica using some old contacts. She does not have the credit score to finance a bicycle, let alone luxury fashion. The second mortgage theory began to crack. If Helen took the money to cover her own secret debts, Jessica would not be dripping in new, untraceable luxury items. Helen is not the mastermind here, Valerie said. She gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. Helen is a pawn. Your mother took out that mortgage because someone squeezed her for it. And based on the sudden influx of high-end cashmere in Jessica's closet, I know exactly who is holding the leash. The betrayal hit me harder than the initial accusation. My sister did not just frame me to cover for our mother. She was actively bleeding our mother dry, and she used my grandmother's death to steal the only remaining asset that could balance the scales. The sapphire was not a life raft for Helen. It was a stepping stone for Jessica. She is wearing the evidence, I whispered. The anger finally broke through the numbness. She is walking around town calling me a thief while she wears the profits on her arm. Valerie stood up and smoothed her slacks. People who steal from their own family always get greedy. They want the money, but they also want the status the money brings. She is flaunting it because she thinks she is untouchable. She thinks you will just sit in this apartment and let the lawyers handle it. I looked at the jeweler's loupe resting on my desk. For 3 weeks, I had waited for the family trust to realize their mistake. I waited for an official investigation. I played the role of the quiet, dignified professional, hoping the truth would naturally surface. But truth does not surface on its own. You have to drag it out of the deep water. I am not waiting anymore, I said, my voice hardening. If she fenced an Edwardian sapphire in New York, she left a signature. Stones like that do not just vanish. They get recut or they get appraised for insurance by private buyers. Valerie gave a sharp, satisfied nod. That is the Bonnie I know. Use your network. Find the appraisal request. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the brass knob. But watch your back. Jessica is reckless, but she is not working alone. A girl with bad credit does not know how to fence a historical artifact. Someone is guiding her. Someone who knows how to move quiet money. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the apartment. The silence did not feel heavy anymore. It felt like a countdown. I pulled my laptop open and logged into the secure portal I used to communicate with the estate auction houses down in Manhattan. Jessica thought she had buried me under a mountain of small-town gossip. She forgot that I spent my life turning over rocks to see what was hiding underneath. The Cold War was over. I was going on the offensive. I cast my net into the deepest waters of the New York jewelry trade. For 3 days, I sent encrypted messages to brokers I trusted. I asked quiet questions about a large Edwardian-cut sapphire entering the gray market. I knew the carat weight by heart, and I knew the specific chemical inclusions that made my grandmother's stone unique. If Jessica tried to sell it, a smart broker would flag the antique cut immediately. The heat was turning up. I could feel the invisible snare tightening around my sister. Then Jessica deployed a tactical strike. She threw a glittering distraction over the entire town to blind them from my quiet inquiries. My phone buzzed on a Thursday morning with a text from an old high school friend who loved watching train wrecks. It was a screenshot of Jessica's social media feed. The picture showed my sister standing on a private Manhattan balcony overlooking Central Park. Her left hand was pressed against a tailored charcoal suit lapel, displaying a diamond ring the size of a marble. The caption read, "1,000 times yes to the love of my life, Richard Sterling." The Sterling name carried a specific kind of weight in our region. They were old money real estate developers who bought up entire city blocks and turned them into glass towers. The family possessed the kind of wealth that insulated them from consequences. My mother, Helen, must have been weeping with joy. Her favorite daughter was marrying into a dynasty. The missing sapphire was instantly buried under a mountain of floral arrangements and venue deposits. The upstate gossip network abandoned the narrative of the criminal appraiser and immediately pivoted to the fairy tale wedding. It was a brilliant, calculated maneuver. Jessica bought herself an impenetrable shield of social armor. I needed to see this supposed Prince Charming for myself. My opportunity arrived 2 days later. I walked into our local artisan coffee shop to pick up my morning roast. The scent of ground espresso beans and toasted almond croissants hung heavy in the warm air. The line was short, but the barista was staring wide-eyed at a couple standing near the pickup counter. It was Jessica. Beside her stood Richard Sterling. He was a tall man, impeccably groomed, radiating the polished arrogance of someone who never had to wait in a line. His charcoal suit was bespoke. I recognized the drape of the Italian wool and the hand-stitched lapels. He looked like money. He looked like power. Jessica saw me first. Her posture stiffened. She stepped slightly behind Richard, letting him absorb the awkward encounter. Richard turned slowly. He held a ceramic cup in one hand and rested the other on Jessica's waist. His fingers pressed firmly into her spine. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of ownership. "You must be Bonnie," Richard said. His voice was smooth, carrying a practiced Manhattan baritone. He did not offer his hand. "And you must be the distraction," I replied, keeping my voice level. A sharp, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. Jessica warned me you had a bitter streak. It is a shame you chose to burn your bridges with your own blood. Helen was heartbroken, you know. But family requires trust, and trust is earned. He spoke like a man giving a corporate lecture. He was actively accelerating my estrangement, positioning himself as the protector of the family I supposedly betrayed. He was sealing Jessica inside a social vacuum where no one could ask difficult questions. Trust is measurable, I countered, looking him directly in the eye, and I appraise things for a living. You can always tell when a piece has a hidden flaw. Richard chuckled. He raised his left arm to adjust his silk tie. The cuff of his bespoke shirt pulled back, revealing a heavy, rose gold watch. The average person would see a Patek Philippe Nautilus and assume the man wearing it commanded a 7-figure salary. But I was not an average person. My eyes automatically cataloged the timepiece. My brain ran a diagnostic check before I even realized I was doing it. The rose gold casing caught the morning light, but the hue was slightly too brassy. True Swiss rose gold contains a specific ratio of copper and platinum that gives it a soft, warm depth. This metal looked harsh. I shifted my gaze to the dial. The date window sat under a magnifying cyclops lens. The magnification was weak, distorting the numeral beneath it. Finally, I watched the second hand. A genuine Patek Philippe movement glides across the dial in a seamless, sweeping motion. This hand was ticking. It was a subtle, microscopic stutter, but it was there. The watch was a counterfeit. It was a high-end replica designed to fool casual observers, but to a trained appraiser, it screamed insolvency. Why would the heir to a Manhattan real estate empire wear a fake watch? Billionaires do not buy replica jewelry to save money. They buy authentic pieces because the asset holds value. The only men who wear fake luxury goods are men trying to project a wealth they no longer possess. Richard caught me staring at his wrist. For a fraction of a second, his smooth facade faltered. He pulled his sleeve down sharply, hiding the watch. His jaw tightened. "We have wedding venues to tour," Richard said, his tone suddenly cold and dismissive. He tightened his grip on Jessica's waist, physically steering her toward the door. "Do us a favor, Bonnie. Stay away from Helen. She does not need your toxicity right now." They walked out into the crisp morning air. I stood near the counter, my pulse hammering a new, terrifying rhythm. The narrative had just twisted violently. Jessica was not marrying a billionaire. She was marrying a mirage. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I stepped outside and answered. It was Aunt Valerie. "I spent the morning running the Sterling corporate structure through my old finance databases," Valerie said. There was no greeting. She sounded out of breath. "The engagement is a smokescreen, Bonnie, but Jessica is not the one holding the matches." "I just saw him," I said, walking down the sidewalk away from the cafe. "Valérie Richard is wearing a counterfeit watch, a bad one. The metal is off and the movement is quartz." Valerie released a sharp breath over the line. "That confirms what I am looking at on my monitor. The Sterling family is rich. But Richard is not. His father is Harrison Sterling. I knew of him during my corporate auditing days. Harrison is a shark. He is a ruthless traditionalist who audits his own family accounts with an iron fist. He controls the trust funds. If a Sterling child steps out of line, Harrison turns off the faucet." I stopped walking. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting again, locking into a much darker picture. "You are saying Richard is cut off." "I am saying Richard has not held an executive position in the family company for 2 years, Valerie corrected. "He has Shell LLCs registered in Delaware, but they show zero revenue. He is floating on debt. A fake watch means he pawned the real one." The cold New York wind bit through my jacket. The situation was no longer about a greedy sister securing her inheritance. The engagement felt less like a romance and more like a hostile takeover. Richard was a drowning man looking for a piece of driftwood to keep him afloat. "Jessica has bad credit and an entry-level job," I murmured, piecing the logic together. "She brings zero financial value to a man who desperately needs liquid cash. Why marry her?" "Because she brought him a dowry," Valerie said quietly. "An antique Edwardian sapphire." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jessica did not steal the necklace to buy designer coats. The coat was just the leftover change. She stole the necklace to buy a husband. She handed our grandmother's legacy to a broke con artist to cover his debts, hoping the sterling name would validate her existence. She was playing a highly dangerous game with a man who was hiding behind a crumbling facade. "He is isolating her," I said. "He told me to stay away from the family. He is building a wall around Jessica so no one can look at his ledgers." "He is cornered," Valerie warned, "and cornered men are unpredictable. We need to find out exactly who Richard owes money to, because if he sold that sapphire on the black market to cover his tracks, those stones are gone forever." I ended the call and looked down the street. The cafe was empty. The illusion was breaking. My sister had successfully banished me from the family, but she had locked herself in a cage with a predator. Saving my own reputation meant I had to tear down her entire house of cards. I needed to dig into Richard Sterling's financial bleed, and I needed to do it before the wedding invitations hit the mail. The digital files Valerie brought to my apartment were printed on thick legal paper. I spread them across my kitchen island. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the ink. Valerie had spent 48 hours digging through the deepest, darkest corners of Manhattan corporate registries. She used her old compliance credentials to pull private equity filings, shell company tax returns, and offshore holding structures. "Look at the dates," Valerie said. She pointed a pen at a highlighted row of numbers. Richard did not just lose his executive title. Harrison Sterling filed a legal notice of separation regarding his son 2 years ago. Harrison legally severed Richard from the family trust. Richard cannot access a single dime of the Sterling empire. I scanned the documents. The numbers were staggering. How is he affording bespoke suits and dinners at country clubs? "He is floating on high-yield debt," Valerie explained. She flipped to the next page. "Banks stopped lending to him 18 months ago, so he went to the secondary market. Unregulated private lenders, the kind of men who do not send collection notices in the mail. They send collectors to your front door. Richard owes $3 million to a holding company operating out of a strip mall in New Jersey." A cold chill settled at the base of my neck. I understood the language of debt. In the estate appraisal business, I saw families torn apart over unpaid mortgages and credit card bills. But $3 million of unregulated debt was not a financial problem. It was a physical threat. Loan sharks. I said the words tasting like ash. "He owes loan sharks." Valerie nodded slowly. "And they want their money. The interest compounds weekly. A man in that position is desperate. He needs liquid assets. He needs untraceable value." The picture clarified, sharpening into a terrifying reality. Jessica did not orchestrate a complicated heist because she wanted to upgrade her wardrobe. She stole our grandmother's Edwardian sapphire to pay the blood price for her own engagement ring. She handed a historical artifact over to a desperate, drowning man so he could buy himself another month of breathing room from his creditors. In exchange, Richard gave her the illusion of status. I needed to see the delusion for myself. I needed to know how deep Jessica had buried her head in the sand. That evening, the Upstate Country Club hosted its weekly dining service. My mother held a membership there for 3 decades. The dining room smelled of prime rib and expensive red wine. I did not walk through the front doors. Instead, I entered through the side terrace, wearing a simple dark coat, and sat at a small iron table hidden behind a row of tall, potted ficus trees. Through the glass double doors, I had a clear line of sight to my mother's regular booth. Helen and Jessica sat across from each other. The crystal chandelier bathed them in warm, flattering light. They were sharing a bottle of expensive champagne. Jessica held her left hand up, letting the counterfeit diamond catch the glow. Her face was flushed with triumph. I cracked the side door open just enough to let the sound filter through the evening air. "He is just so transparent," Jessica said, leaning across the table. Her voice carried the loud, performative tone of someone who wanted the neighboring tables to hear. "That is what I love about Richard. There are no secrets between us. He values honesty above everything else." Helen smiled, a soft, dreaming expression on her face. You deserve a man who can provide true security, sweetheart. The Sterling family represents stability. They build foundations." The dramatic irony was suffocating. I sat in the shadows, gripping the edge of the wrought iron table. My sister was boasting about financial security and transparency, while the man she planned to marry was actively hunted by underground debt collectors. She was bragging about a dynasty that had legally exiled her fiancé. She traded her grandmother's legacy for a hollow shell. Every sip of champagne she took was funded by a lie. I watched them order dessert. I watched them laugh. The anger in my chest gave way to a sudden, sharp ache of pity. Jessica was cruel, and she had destroyed my reputation without a second thought. But she was walking blindly into a trap that would ruin her life. Richard would bleed her dry, take whatever assets she could steal, and leave her to face the collectors when the money ran out. I made a decision. It was a foolish, optimistic decision born out of a lingering sense of duty to the woman who raised me. I would offer one final olive branch. I would warn my mother. I waited by the valet stand. The night air was biting, carrying the scent of pine and exhaust. 10 minutes later, Helen walked out the brass front doors alone. Jessica was lingering inside to sign the check. My mother wrapped her scarf tight around her neck and stepped toward the driveway. "Mom," I said, stepping out from the shadow of the stone pillar. Helen recoiled. Her eyes widened, scanning the driveway to see if anyone was watching. "Bonnie, what are you doing here? You cannot just stalk us in public." "I am not stalking you," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need you to listen to me. 2 minutes, that is all I ask." She crossed her arms, her posture rigid with defense. "I have nothing to say to you. You broke this family. Jessica is lying to you." I pushed forward, refusing to let her turn away. "And Richard is lying to Jessica." "I ran his financials, Mom. I checked the corporate registries. Richard is cut off from the Sterling Trust. He owes millions of dollars to unregulated private lenders. He is broke, Mom. He is drowning in debt, and he is using Jessica to stay afloat." Helen stared at me. For one brief second, a flicker of doubt crossed her features. She knew Richard was moving too fast. She knew the engagement was rushed. But accepting my truth meant acknowledging she had thrown her honest daughter away to protect a thief. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, searing contempt. "You are sick," Helen whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You are so eaten up by jealousy that you would invent a story like this to ruin your sister's happiness." "It is not a story. I have the documents." I reached into my coat pocket. "I do not want to see your forged papers," Helen snapped, swatting my hand away. "You could not handle the fact that Jessica found a man who can give her the world. You could not stand watching her succeed while you sit alone in your apartment appraising dusty junk. So you steal from your own grandmother, and now you try to poison my mind against my future son-in-law." "Mom, he took the sapphire. Jessica gave it to him to pay his debts." "Do not ever speak to me again," Helen said. The finality in her tone was absolute. The valet pulled her sedan up to the curb. She opened the door, refusing to look back at me. "Do not come to the engagement party, Bonnie. If you show up, Richard will have his security throw you out. You are dead to us." She slammed the car door. The vehicle sped away, leaving me standing alone on the cold asphalt. The olive branch was broken. My mother chose the glittering delusion over the ugly truth. She chose the counterfeit diamond over her own flesh and blood. The rejection burned, but it also burned away the last remnants of my hesitation. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to save them from the fire. Now the only thing left to save was myself. Gossip and logic were not enough to fight a family that chose willful blindness. I needed undeniable physical proof. I needed a weapon so sharp they could not look away from it. If Jessica fenced the necklace to pay Richard's debts, she had to physically remove the stones from the safe. And if she removed them from the safe, she did it inside Grandma Rose's house. I walked to my car, my mind racing through the floor plan of the Victorian property. The house was empty. The real estate agents were preparing to list it on the market next week. My mother had changed the locks, but locks only keep honest people out. I was no longer playing by honest rules. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Aunt Valerie. She did not listen, I said into the receiver. I told you she wouldn't, Valerie replied, her tone pragmatic. People protect their investments, Bonnie. Helen invested everything in Jessica. We need to get into the house, I said, starting my engine. Tonight, before the realtors stage the property and throw away the paper trail. Jessica made a mistake. Desperate people always leave a trace. I am going to find it. The engine roared to life. The conflict shifted from a war of words to a physical infiltration. The stakes were rising, and I was out of time. The morning sunlight filtered through the slatted blinds of my downtown office, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. This room was my sanctuary. It smelled of old paper leather bindings and the faint metallic tang of brass polish. I built my independent appraisal firm from nothing. At 24, while my peers spent their weekends traveling or climbing corporate ladders, I took out a predatory small business loan. I spent years hunched over jeweler scales and studying antique hallmarks until my eyes ached. I earned my reputation inch by inch. In the estate liquidation business, trust is the only currency that matters. Families invite you into their homes during their most vulnerable moments. They trust you not to steal the silver. My desk phone rang. The shrill sound shattered the quiet focus of the room. I picked up the receiver, balancing it between my shoulder and ear as I adjusted the focus on my magnifying loop. Bonnie Jones speaking. Bonnie, it is Thomas Caldwell. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior partner at a premier Manhattan liquidation agency. He was my most lucrative client. We spent 6 months negotiating the inventory contract for a sprawling, historic property in the Hamptons. The retainer alone would cover my commercial lease for the next 2 years. Thomas, good morning, I said, setting the loop down. I am just reviewing the final addendums for the Kensington estate. We are ready to break ground on the cataloging next Tuesday. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the line. We are pulling the contract, Bonnie, Thomas said. His tone lacked its usual warm professionalism. His voice carried the sterile chill of a medical examiner reading a toe tag. The agency is terminating our working relationship effective immediately. My hand froze over the desk blotter. Excuse me, Thomas, the ink is dry. We finalized the logistics yesterday. Did I miss a compliance filing? You missed nothing on the paperwork, he replied, his words clipped and defensive. But my inbox received a very troubling anonymous dossier this morning. It contained detailed allegations regarding your recent conduct during your grandmother's estate settlement. The document included statements outlining a gross breach of fiduciary duty and the disappearance of a high-value historical artifact. The air evaporated from my lungs. Jessica and Richard did not just spread rumors at the local country club. They codified the lie. They packaged it, weaponized it, and fired it directly into the heart of my livelihood. Thomas, that is a coordinated slander campaign, I urged, keeping my voice level despite the tremor vibrating through my fingers. My sister is attempting to cover up her own financial misconduct. I am gathering the proof to clear my name. I can send you the preliminary findings today. I am running a high-end liquidation firm, Bonnie, not a courtroom. Thomas interrupted. He sounded tired. I deal with grieving billionaires. The mere whisper of an appraiser pocketing family heirlooms is a radioactive liability. I cannot put you inside the Kensington property. The board voted 10 minutes ago. The decision is final. Do not contact this office again. The line clicked dead. A dial tone hummed in my ear. I set the receiver down. My hands felt numb. Before I could process the magnitude of the Caldwell cancellation, a notification chimed on my computer monitor. An email from the Heritage Trust Group, my second largest corporate account. The subject line read, "Suspension of Services." I clicked the message. The text was brief, citing a pending internal review regarding ethical concerns brought to their attention by an unnamed source. They froze my retainer. In the span of 10 minutes, the foundation of my entire adult life crumbled into dust. Richard Sterling acted with swift, terrifying precision. Following my confrontation with Helen in the parking lot, my mother undoubtedly called Jessica. She told her future son-in-law that I ran his background, that I knew about his unregulated debt, and that I was hunting for the truth. Richard recognized the threat. He realized gossip would not stop an investigator. He had to sever my resources. If I had no income, I could not afford to fight him. I would spend my energy trying to survive instead of trying to expose his fraud. I packed my briefcase in silence. I locked the office door and walked to my car. The drive to my apartment felt like navigating underwater. The colors of the city bled together. I unlocked my front door, dropped my keys on the counter, and slid down the wall until I hit the hardwood floor. The financial math cascaded through my brain. Without the Caldwell and Heritage contracts, my projected revenue dropped to zero. I had 30 days of operating capital left in my business account. After that, I would default on the office lease. The banks would call the loans. I would lose the firm. The emotional weight of the betrayal finally caught up with the financial terror. My sister orchestrated this execution. She fed my career into a wood chipper just to buy herself a counterfeit fairy tale. The urge to surrender settled over my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. If I just stopped digging, maybe the bleeding would cease. I could close the firm, pack my bags, and leave New York. I could start over, somewhere else, somewhere the Jones family name meant nothing. The temptation to walk away was a physical ache. A sharp knock rapped against my apartment door. I did not move. I stared at the grain of the floorboards. The knock sounded again, harder this time, rattling the brass hinges. "Open the door, Bonnie. I can see your car in the lot." Aunt Valerie's voice brooked no argument. I pushed myself up from the floor, my joints aching as if I had aged a decade in a single afternoon. I unbolted the door. Valerie stepped inside, taking one look at my pale face and the unbuttoned collar of my blouse. She did not offer a hug. She did not tilt her head in pity. She walked straight to the kitchen island and dropped her leather tote bag on the granite. "They hit your business," Valerie stated. It was not a question. "They burned it to the ground," I corrected, my voice cracking. Jessica and Richard sent anonymous dossiers to my Manhattan clients. They pulled my contracts. I have a month of runway left before the bank liquidates my office. I expected Valerie to offer a sympathetic sigh. Instead, a sharp, predatory gleam sparked in her dark eyes. "Good," Valerie said. I stared at her, certain I misheard the word. "Good, Valerie, I am bankrupt. My reputation in the appraisal network is toxic waste." "You are bleeding," she acknowledged, leaning against the counter, "but you are looking at the board from the perspective of a victim. Look at it from the perspective of an auditor. Why did Richard strike your corporate accounts today?" "Because I warned my mother about his debt last night. He is trying to destroy me." "He is trying to distract you," Valerie corrected, pointing a stern finger at my chest. "If Richard held the high ground, he would ignore you. A wealthy, secure man does not care if a banished sister-in-law asks questions. But Richard is a desperate man, drowning in loan shark debt. He panicked. He spent time and energy drafting those dossiers because you are dangerously close to a nerve. He wants you curled up on the floor crying over your bank statements so you stop looking at his." Her logic sliced through the fog in my brain. The panic response. Richard overplayed his hand. By attacking my livelihood, he confirmed my theory. The sapphire was the linchpin holding his entire fraudulent engagement together. Desperate people make sloppy mistakes. "Bonnie." Valerie continued, her tone dropping into a tactical register. "Jessica had to physically remove those stones from the safe. Your grandmother was a highly suspicious woman. She did not trust the hospice nurses, and she certainly did not trust Jessica. Did Rose leave a paper trail, a secondary ledger?" I closed my eyes, visualizing the wood-paneled study, the smell of lemon polish, the row of filing cabinets, the chaotic inventory process interrupted by Jessica's screaming accusation. I never finished the sweep of the room. I never checked the structural anomalies. "The Victorian goes on the market this Friday," I said, opening my eyes. The urge to surrender vanished, replaced by a cold, searing focus. "The staging company arrives tomorrow morning to clear the remaining furniture and box up the files." "Then our window is closing," Valerie said. She unzipped her tote bag and pulled out a small metallic object, tossing it onto the kitchen island. It clattered against the granite. It was a brass skeleton key. "Helen keeps a spare key to the cellar doors hidden in the garden shed," Valerie said, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "I acquired it during the funeral reception while everyone was crying over the finger sandwiches. The cellar connects directly to the main hallway." I looked at the key. The stakes evolved from a damaged professional reputation to raw, unadulterated survival. If I failed to find proof tonight, I would lose everything. My firm, my identity, my future. But if I succeeded, I held the power to detonate Richard's life in front of the entire Sterling dynasty. "We go in at midnight," I said, grabbing my dark wool coat from the back of the chair, "before the staging crew erases the crime scene." The trap was waiting. It was time to walk back into the lion's den. Before the brass skeleton key ever turned in the rusted cellar lock, I needed to understand the battlefield. I needed to understand the mind of the woman who built the fortress we were about to breach. Grandma Rose was a woman carved from New England granite. She did not succumb to the softening of the mind that often accompanies the twilight of a long life. During her final lucid weeks, the oxygen concentrator hissed a steady rhythm in the corner of her primary bedroom, but her eyes remained sharp, tracking every movement in the house. She possessed the kind of wealth that drew people like moths to a porch light. She knew her family coveted her estate, and she trusted her hired help even less. Rose spent her days sitting in a high-backed armchair, observing the rotating staff of hospice nurses who fluttered around her. They thought she was sleeping when she closed her eyes. She was not. She was listening to the squeak of their rubber soles on the hardwood floors. She was memorizing the duration of their footsteps down the hallway. One Tuesday afternoon, a young nurse named Clara spent an unusually long time dusting the wood-paneled study. When Clara finally emerged to check the oxygen levels, Rose waited for the girl to leave the room to fetch a glass of water. Rose pushed herself up from the armchair. Her joints ached, radiating a dull, persistent heat. But she forced herself to walk down the hall. She stood in the doorway of her study and scanned the room. Rose possessed a photographic memory for her own possessions. The silver letter opener on her mahogany desk sat at a 45-degree angle. That morning, it had been parallel to the ink blotter. The leather-bound volumes on the second shelf were pushed back half an inch. Someone was looking for the wall safe. Rose did not fire the nurse. Firing the girl would just bring a new, unknown threat into the house. Instead, Rose picked up her rotary telephone and dialed a private audiovisual security firm based out of Albany. She requested an unlisted, off-the-books installation. The technician arrived 2 days later under the guise of repairing the radiator. He was a nervous man who sweated under Rose's piercing gaze. He brought a ladder into the study and spent 2 hours drilling a microscopic hole into the ornate crown molding directly across from the mahogany wall panel that hid the safe. He embedded a lens no larger than a pinpoint into the plaster. Rose opened her bedside drawer and handed the sweating technician a thick envelope of crisp, untraceable bills. She paid for the hardware, the silence, and a prepaid encrypted cloud synchronization protocol. She ensured that no matter what happened to her physical body, her legacy would remain under permanent surveillance. The hiss of the oxygen concentrator faded, replaced by the biting chill of the midnight wind. I stood in the shadows of the Victorian home, my breath pluming in the freezing air. The present reality settled over my shoulders. The property sat dark and silent, looming against the starless upstate sky. The staging company would arrive in 6 hours to pack the remaining personal effects into cardboard boxes. This was our only window. Valerie crouched near the foundation, pushing aside a tangle of overgrown rose bushes to expose the slanted wooden cellar doors. She slipped the brass skeleton key into the iron padlock. The mechanism offered a stubborn grind before clicking open. Valerie lifted the heavy wooden hatch. The hinges groaned a low, protesting sound that made my pulse jump into my throat. We descended the concrete steps into the basement. The air smelled of damp earth, old newspapers, and copper piping. Valerie clicked on a small, high-powered tactical flashlight. The narrow beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating walls lined with dusty canning jars and forgotten winter coats. "Step exactly where I step," Valerie whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the distant water heater. Old floorboards settle near the supporting joists. If you step in the center of the planks, the wood will scream. I followed her, placing my boots carefully in her invisible footprints. We navigated the narrow wooden staircase leading up to the main hallway. The kitchen door opened with a soft click. The house felt like a tomb. Without the ticking of the grandfather clock or the scent of lemon polish, the space was a hollow shell waiting to be sold. We moved in total silence toward the study. The heavy oak door stood ajar. I pushed it open, stepping into the room where my exile began. The mahogany panel was slid back. The steel door of the safe hung open, a gaping, dark mouth mocking my arrival. The room was in a state of clinical disarray. The staging company had already delivered stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape, leaning them against the leather armchair. The physical files Valerie directed, shining her beam toward a row of green metal cabinets tucked in the corner. If Rose paid for a service, she kept the receipt. She never threw away a ledger. Take the top drawer. I will take the bottom. I approached the cabinet and pulled the handle. The metal track hissed. I pulled out a handful of manila folders, holding my flashlight between my teeth to free my hands. The files were a chaotic mix of utility bills, property tax assessments, and vintage appraisal documents. I sifted through the thick paper, my eyes scanning the headers. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours. The tension in the quiet room tightened my chest. Every passing car on the distant highway sounded like a police cruiser. Every shift of the house settling sounded like a footstep in the hall. Look for independent contractors, Valerie murmured from the floor, her hands flipping through medical receipts. Plumbers, electricians, landscapers, anything that does not have a recognizable corporate logo. I grabbed the next thick folder labeled Maintenance. I thumbed through invoices for roof repairs and chimney sweeps. Near the back of the stack, my fingers brushed against a different texture. It was a thin, crinkled piece of carbon copy paper. I pulled it out and aimed the flashlight beam directly at the faded blue ink. The header read, Apex Audiovisual Solutions, Albany. My breath hitched. I traced the line items with my index finger. Item 1, micro lens hardware. Item 2, crown molding integration. Item 3, 12-month encrypted cloud server hosting. The date on the receipt was exactly 4 months before my grandmother passed away. Valerie, I breathed, lowering the flashlight. She stood up, brushing dust from her dark slacks, and took the paper from my trembling hand. She read the lines in silence. When she looked up, her dark eyes reflected the narrow beam of light. She recorded it, Valerie whispered, her voice thick with sudden awe. Rose filmed the safe. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The theft, the lie, the betrayal. It was all captured. Every second of Jessica opening that steel door and taking the sapphire existed in high definition. We did not just have a theory anymore. We had a witness. I turned around, sweeping my flashlight beam across the room. I aimed the circle of light at the mahogany wall panel, then traced the beam directly backward across the floral rug, up the opposite wall, and onto the ornate wooden crown molding near the ceiling. The light stopped. The triumph in my chest turned to ice. There, perfectly centered across from the safe, the pristine white molding was ruined. The wood was splintered and gouged. A jagged, ugly hole marred the plaster. White dust coated the leather binding of the books on the shelf directly below it. She found it, I said. My voice sounded hollow in the quiet room. Valerie stepped to my side and followed the beam of light up to the ceiling. Jessica did not find that on her own. Someone told her to sweep the room for surveillance. Richard. The physical lens is gone, I said, a wave of despair threatening to pull me under. They ripped the camera out of the wall. They destroyed the hardware. Valerie lowered the flashlight, plunging the ceiling back into darkness. She looked down at the crinkled carbon paper in her hand. A slow, dangerous smile curved her lips. The camera is just glass and wire, Bonnie, Valerie said, tapping the third line item on the receipt. Richard is a trust fund kid who thinks breaking a toy makes the problem go away. but he does not understand digital infrastructure. The camera does not hold the footage. She held the receipt up to the light. The footage lives on the cloud server. The data still exists. We just have to break into the vault. Mallory pulled a slim black tablet from her leather tote bag and set it on the dusty mahogany desk. She propped a small flashlight beside it, casting a sharp circle of illumination over the crinkled Apex audiovisual receipt. Her fingers moved rapidly across the glass screen, typing the encrypted web address listed under the service agreement. The study was so quiet I could hear the soft, rhythmic tap of her manicured nails striking the digital keyboard. A loading bar appeared. The server portal materialized, bearing a sterile, gray interface. Valerie typed in the account number printed on our single piece of evidence. She hit enter. The screen blinked. A white box popped up in the center of the display. 2-factor authentication required. A security code has been sent to the mobile device ending in 47. I stared at the glowing prompt. The numbers matched my grandmother's old cellular phone. The triumph that had warmed my chest only moments ago vanished, replaced by a deep, hollow chill. My mother handled the estate finances immediately following the funeral. Helen was a woman who abhorred unnecessary expenses, especially when she was drowning in secret 6-figure debt. She terminated Rose's mobile contract 3 weeks ago. The phone line was dead. The physical device was sitting in a cardboard donation box at a local charity center. The digital key required to unlock the cloud server was gone forever. Valerie let out a slow, measured breath. She closed the browser window and turned off the tablet screen. We hit a technological concrete wall. The cloud was a digital fortress, and without the authentication token, trying to hack a commercial-grade security server from a basement study was a mathematical impossibility. Jessica and Richard won. They destroyed the physical lens, and the digital backup was locked behind a dead phone number. I gripped the edge of the desk. The staging company would arrive in less than 4 hours. The sun would rise, the house would be cleared, and my last chance to clear my name would be loaded into a moving truck. Valerie picked up her flashlight. She did not look defeated. She looked annoyed. People who spend their entire lives guarding their wealth do not trust invisible technology, Valerie stated, sweeping her light across the dark room. Rose paid for a cloud service because the technician recommended it, but she was a woman who kept cash under her floorboards during the banking crisis. She wanted things she could hold in her hands. If she recorded someone in her house, she did not just leave that recording floating in the ether. She downloaded it, I realized, following Valerie's logic. If she caught someone moving her things, she would want a hard copy of the evidence. We tore the study apart. The adrenaline flushed the exhaustion from my system. I relied on my decade of training in estate liquidation. Appraisers do not just look at the surface of an object. They look at the construction. I pulled the drawers out of the mahogany desk, reaching into the dark cavity to feel for taped envelopes or hidden false backs. I ran my fingertips along the undersides of the heavy wooden shelves, searching for the rough texture of a concealed thumb drive. Valerie took the filing cabinets. She removed every single manila folder, shaking them upside down. Decades of mundane paperwork spilled onto the floral rug, but no digital storage device fell from the pages. We checked behind the framed oil paintings. We lifted the heavy Persian rug to inspect the floorboards. Nothing. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. 3 in the morning. Time was bleeding away. The cold air of the unheated house seeped through my wool coat, settling deep into my bones. I leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, wiping a thin layer of sweat from my forehead. My breathing sounded loud and ragged in the quiet room. My flashlight beam drifted across the room and settled on the towering bookcases flanking the stone fireplace. Grandma Rose possessed a meticulous, almost clinical obsession with order. During my childhood, if I took a book from her library and replaced it an inch out of alignment, she would notice within minutes. Her literature was categorized by genre, then by author, and finally by the publication date. The spines of her vintage hardcovers always formed a perfectly flush wall of leather and gold foil. I remembered the morning of the inventory right before Jessica walked in and screamed her accusation. I had stood in the center of the room cataloging the furniture and noticed a strange visual anomaly. I stepped away from the door frame and walked toward the right side bookcase. I aimed the flashlight at the bottom shelf. There, sitting between two thick volumes of Victorian poetry, was a worn, leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. The spine protruded 1/4 of an inch past the neighboring books. It was misaligned. Earlier that day, it seemed like a throwaway detail, a dying woman's failing grip, a minor oversight by a careless hospice nurse. But staring at it now, with Valerie's logic ringing in my ears, the book took on a different shape. Rose was a woman of literature. She found solace in grand narratives. Alexandre Dumas wrote the ultimate story of betrayal. The protagonist is falsely accused of a crime, stripped of his life, and banished to a dark cell by men who smile in his face. He escapes, secures a vast fortune, and executes a meticulous, devastating revenge upon the people who framed him. It was not just a novel, it was a blueprint. I reached out and hooked my index finger over the top edge of the spine. I pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. The weight was wrong. A book of that size, printed on dense 19th century paper, should carry a significant heft. This object felt too light in my hands. Valerie stepped to my side, her flashlight beam merging with mine. I opened the leather cover. The title page was intact, but the rest of the text block was gone. The pages were glued together, creating a solid paper brick. In the center, a precise rectangular cavity had been carved out with a razor blade. Resting inside the hollowed-out depression was a sleek, silver, solid-state hard drive. My breath caught in my throat. I picked up the metal rectangle. It was cold to the touch. Rose did not trust the cloud. She downloaded the footage, unhooked the drive, and hid it inside a story about false accusations and vengeance. She left me the weapon. I just had to be smart enough to find it. "You found the ledger," Valerie whispered, a fierce, triumphant edge to her voice. We did not waste a single second celebrating. The victory meant nothing until we saw the video. Valerie cleared a space on the dusty desk and booted up her encrypted tablet. I plugged the provided adapter cable into the silver drive and connected it to the device. The tablet recognized the external hardware. A small icon appeared on the screen, labeled simply with the letter R. I tapped the icon. My heart hammered against my ribs, anticipating the high-definition validation of my innocence. I wanted to see Jessica's face as she opened the safe. I wanted to watch her steal her own future. The screen flashed black. A red padlock icon materialized in the center of the display. A digital keyboard popped up on the bottom half of the screen. A security prompt appeared in stark white text. Drive encrypted. Enter passcode to decrypt volume. I stared at the flashing cursor. Rose secured the physical drive with a cryptographic lock. We possessed the weapon, but the trigger was secured behind a passcode. The staging crew would arrive in 3 hours. Richard was actively destroying my professional life in Manhattan, and the only proof of my innocence was trapped behind a riddle designed by a paranoid, dying woman. The blinking cursor on the tablet mocked us. A digital padlock stood between my ruined reputation and my salvation. Valerie leaned back from the desk, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. She possessed the tools to crack basic security protocols, but this was a commercial-grade encryption algorithm. A standard breach attempt would take a supercomputer years to decode. We had less than 3 hours before the staging crew arrived. I looked down at the hollowed-out copy of The Count of Monte Cristo resting in my hands. Grandma Rose did not leave things to chance. If she hid a drive inside a book, she did not memorize a random string of numbers for the passcode. She anchored the lock to something she would never forget. She anchored it to the story itself. I ran my fingertips over the glued edges of the paper cavity. The center was carved out, but the first chapter and the final pages remained intact. Rose was a lifelong academic. She never read a novel without a yellow highlighter in her hand. She viewed books as conversations, annotating the margins with her sharp, pragmatic observations. I flipped the heavy front cover open. The title page was clean. I turned the book over and opened the back cover, exposing the final printed pages of the text. A single line of dialogue glowed with a faded stroke of yellow ink. It was the final sentence of the novel, delivered by the protagonist after he dismantled the lives of the men who betrayed him. I read the words aloud, my voice a dry whisper in the cold study. All human wisdom is contained in these two words: wait and hope. Valerie did not hesitate. She pulled the tablet closer, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard. She typed the phrase without spaces, capital W, capital H. She hit the enter key. The red padlock icon vanished. A green progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling from left to right. The drive was decrypting. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, watching the digital line inch across the glass. The silence in the house felt heavier now, pregnant with the impending revelation. When the bar reached the opposite side, the screen flashed. A single video file populated the folder. The timestamp read, a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before Rose passed away. I reached out and tapped the play button. The video opened instantly in flawless high definition. The private firm Rose hired did not install a cheap, grainy security camera. They installed a broadcast-quality lens. The lighting in the study was perfectly balanced. The audio channel crackled to life so sensitive it picked up the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The frame showed the empty study. 10 seconds passed. Then the heavy oak door creaked open. Jessica stepped into the room. Seeing my sister on the screen sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through my veins. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, her hair styled in a meticulous blowout. She looked over her shoulder, checking the hallway before stepping toward the mahogany wall panel. Her movements lacked any hesitation. She did not stumble or search for the safe. She walked with the focused, chilling determination of someone executing a premeditated strike. She slid the wood panel aside. Her fingers moved swiftly over the brass dial, inputting the numeric combination. The heavy steel door swung open. A wave of vindication washed over me. I wanted to freeze the frame, print the image, and nail it to the front door of every person in upstate New York who called me a thief. But the validation was a fleeting comfort. The video kept playing, and the narrative was about to fracture. Jessica reached into the safe and pulled out the faded blue velvet box. She opened the lid, staring down at the heirloom. Footsteps echoed on the audio track. Heavy, frantic footfalls striding down the hallway. Richard Sterling burst into the frame. The polished, arrogant Manhattan scion I met at the cafe was gone. The man on the screen looked unhinged. His tie hung loose, his bespoke suit jacket unbuttoned, sweat shined on his forehead. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and grabbed Jessica by the arm. The audio captured his voice. It was raw, stripped of its practiced baritone, vibrating with genuine terror. "Do you have it?" Richard demanded, his grip tightening on her wrist. Jessica flinched, holding the velvet box against her chest. "I have it. But Richard, if the lawyers notice this is missing before the will is read, they will audit the entire estate. We should wait." "We cannot wait," Richard hissed. He stepped closer, crowding her against the mahogany desk. "My father's forensic accountants are reviewing my shell companies tomorrow morning. The private lenders are demanding a payment by midnight. If I do not hand them collateral tonight, they will break my legs. And if my father finds out I borrowed from unregulated street lenders, he will permanently sever my trust. I will lose the family name." The scene played out with agonizing clarity. Jessica stood at the crossroads. She could put the necklace back, protect her family, and walk away from a fraudulent man. Instead, she looked at the panic in his eyes, calculated the value of the sterling social status, and made her choice. She willingly handed our grandmother's legacy to a broke con artist to buy her way into a dynasty. She defrauded her own bloodline for an engagement ring. Richard snatched the box from her hands. He snapped the lid shut and shoved it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "Wipe down the dial," he ordered. "Make sure you do not leave any prints on the steel. Blame the appraiser when the box turns up empty." Jessica turned her back to the camera, pulling a silk handkerchief from her pocket to polish the brass safe dial. She was actively constructing my exile. Richard did not leave the room immediately. He walked to the opposite side of the study, moving out of Jessica's line of sight, stepping perfectly into the center of the hidden camera's focal range. He pulled a sleek black cell phone from his trousers. He dialed a number and pressed the speaker to his ear. He glanced over his shoulder to ensure Jessica remained distracted by the safe. "It is Sterling," Richard whispered into the receiver. The high-definition microphone embedded in the crown molding picked up every single syllable. "I have the collateral. I am bringing it to your shop in Manhattan tonight." A muffled voice crackled through the earpiece. The person on the other end asked a brief question. Richard covered his mouth with his free hand, his eyes darting toward my sister. "No, do not prep the vault," he murmured. "It is a fake. The private appraiser checked the chemical composition yesterday. It is a cubic zirconia replica set in cheap brass. The old lady must have sold the real sapphire decades ago and swapped it with a prop to keep up appearances." The tablet screen seemed to freeze, though the video continued to play. My lungs stopped drawing air. The silence in the dark basement study became a physical weight pressing against my ribs. Jessica ruined her sister, manipulated her mother, and sold her soul to a loan shark's target for a worthless piece of glass. Grandma Rose was a ruthless pragmatist. When my grandfather died, the family finances took a steep decline. The upstate gossip network assumed Rose lived on a vast, untouched fortune. But Rose understood the prestige did not pay the heating bills. She quietly liquidated the Edwardian sapphire years ago to maintain her lifestyle, replacing it with a flawless replica. She kept the secret hidden in the wall safe, knowing her greedy descendants would eventually fight over it. She let them fight over a shadow. The video ended, the screen fading to black. Valerie stared at the tablet, her jaw tight, processing the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Jessica built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, and Richard was attempting to pawn a fake jewel to dangerous men who did not accept apologies or cubic zirconia. I pulled the silver drive from the adapter. The metal felt warm in my palm. We possessed the weapon. We held the undisputed proof of my innocence, Jessica's guilt, and Richard's financial ruin. But acquiring the truth was only the first step. Dropping a bomb of this magnitude required a stage, a captive audience, and a target who could not run away. Before I could formulate the strategy, my own cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket, shattering the quiet of the room. A security alert from my downtown office flashed across the screen. Someone was bypassing the receptionist desk. Someone was waiting for me in the dark. And based on the desperate panic I just witnessed on the video, I knew exactly who was hunting for the loose ends. The drive from the Victorian estate to my downtown office took 20 minutes. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green in the pre-dawn darkness. The streets of upstate New York were empty, slick with a fine layer of morning mist. The silver solid-state drive sat heavy in my coat pocket. It felt like holding a live wire. I possessed the undeniable proof of my innocence, but carrying the truth was a fragile burden. I needed to secure the hardware inside my commercial-grade office safe before formulating the next phase of the strategy. I pulled into the gravel parking lot behind my building. The brick facade loomed in the dark, a familiar and comforting silhouette. My firm occupied the second floor of a renovated textile mill. It was a space designed for quiet concentration, far removed from the chaotic social circles my family frequented. I unlocked the heavy steel exterior door and climbed the wooden staircase. My boots echoed against the worn treads. The silence of the early morning usually brought a sense of peace, but today the stillness felt expectant. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped. The frosted glass pane on my office door was dark, but the brass deadbolt was unlocked. My stomach contracted. The security alert on my phone was not a glitch. Someone bypassed the electronic keypad. I pushed the door open. The familiar scent of old paper and brass polish was tainted by the sharp, metallic odor of expensive bergamot cologne. The street lamp outside cast long, harsh shadows through the slatted window blinds. Sitting in the leather guest chair across from my mahogany desk was Richard Sterling. He did not look like a man preparing for a society wedding. The bespoke charcoal suit he wore at the Artisan Cafe was rumpled. His silk tie hung loose around his collar. He sat, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. The polished, arrogant Manhattan scion was gone. In his place sat a cornered, predatory animal. "You are out early, Bonnie," Richard said. His voice was a low, rasping scrape in the quiet room. I stood in the doorway, keeping my hand near the brass knob. "Breaking and entering is a felony in this state. You need to leave my office." Richard stood up. He was a tall man, and the cramped dimensions of my office amplified his physical presence. He took a slow step toward my desk. "You logged into a secure network 15 minutes ago. I pay a security firm a very high retainer to monitor digital tripwires on certain accounts. When you connected that drive to verify the file format, the cloud server caught the local handshake. You pinged a cell tower 3 miles from here." He knew about the hidden camera. He knew Rose recorded the theft. He spent whatever remaining cash he possessed to guard the digital perimeter, terrified someone would find the footage before he could pawn the collateral. "The Victorian property was full of old hardware," I replied, keeping my tone analytical and detached. I relied on my professional training, adopting the same unbothered posture I used when negotiating with hostile estate executors. "I was conducting a final sweep for the inventory." Richard stepped closer, closing the distance until the edge of the mahogany desk pressed into his thighs. The street lamp illuminated his face. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, bruised circles of exhaustion. A faint tremor vibrated through his left hand. "Do not play games with me," Richard hissed. He planted his palms flat on the desk blotter, leaning his upper body toward me. The physical intimidation was deliberate. He wanted to crowd my space, to force a retreat. "I know exactly what you found, and I am telling you right now, if you try to use it, you will not survive the fallout." I held my ground. I did not step back. I looked at the pulse hammering against the skin of his neck. "Are you threatening me, Richard?" "I am giving you a guarantee," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You think you uncovered a scandal. You think you can march into my life and ruin my engagement. You have no idea who you are dealing with. My father is Harrison Sterling. He retains a legal team in Manhattan that costs more per hour than your entire firm bills in a decade." He outlined a barrage of legal warfare. He promised to file immediate injunctions against me. He threatened to bury my business under a mountain of defamation suits. He described a coordinated campaign to strip my professional appraisal licenses and freeze my bank accounts. He vowed to make me unhireable across the entire eastern seaboard. He wanted to crush me under the sheer weight of billionaire intimidation. "If you ever mention the sapphire," Richard continued, his breath frosting the cold air between us, "I will ensure you spend the rest of your life tied up in litigation. You will lose this office. You will lose your car. You will be bankrupt before the leaves change color." I listened to his barrage of threats. A week ago, this speech would have paralyzed me. I would have collapsed under the fear of fighting a dynasty. But sitting in the dark basement of the Victorian house, I watched this same man beg my sister to save his life. I heard him admit to defrauding unregulated street lenders. I knew the truth. The dramatic irony was a shield. Richard was threatening me with an army he did not command. He invoked Harrison Sterling's name like a loaded weapon, but I knew the gun was empty. His father legally disowned him 2 years ago. The Manhattan legal team would never answer his calls. He was bluffing, trying to project a power he no longer possessed, relying on the Sterling reputation to force my surrender. I looked at his left wrist. The counterfeit rose gold watch caught a sliver of light. The ticking second hand was a silent testament to his profound insolvency. He was protecting a fake jewel to pay off a real debt. He was a walking contradiction wrapped in a wrinkled suit. Richard reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He tossed it onto my desk. It landed with a soft slide across the leather blotter. "That is a non-disclosure agreement," Richard ordered. He straightened his posture, attempting to reclaim his authority. "Sign it. You surrender the drive to me. You waive any claim to the estate inventory, and you walk away." If you sign it, I will convince Jessica to call off the local gossip. You can keep your little antique shop open." I looked down at the envelope. I did not reach for it. "There is one more condition," Richard added, his tone sharpening into a final command. "You are explicitly forbidden from attending the engagement gala this weekend. You will not come anywhere near the Hudson Valley estate. You are done with this family." He waited for my compliance. He expected me to reach for a pen, broken and terrified by his display of dominance. He wanted the quiet, obedient sister to fade into the background. I looked up from the envelope and met his bloodshot eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I let the cold, clinical detachment of my profession guide my response. "You are sweating, Richard," I observed softly. He blinked, thrown off balance by the mundane statement. "What did you say?" "You are sweating," I repeated, "and your hands are shaking. If you actually had Harrison Sterling's legal team on standby, you would have sent a courier with a cease and desist letter. You would be sleeping in a penthouse right now. You would not be standing in a dusty office at 5 in the morning trying to intimidate a small-town appraiser." His jaw clenched. The muscles in his cheek twitched. The facade cracked, revealing the raw panic festering underneath. "I reject your non-disclosure agreement," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "I will not surrender the drive. I will not walk away from the slander my sister subjected me to. You both decided to make this a public spectacle when you fed my name to the corporate liquidation agencies in New York. You wanted to play in the dirt." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization that his bluff failed paralyzed him. He realized he was not dealing with a fragile victim. He was dealing with a woman who had nothing left to lose. I picked up the white envelope from my desk and handed it back to him. He did not take it. I let it flutter to the floor landing near the toe of his expensive leather shoe. "The retaliation must match the venue," I told him, locking my gaze onto his. "You told my mother I was a thief. You told my clients I was a liability. You wanted an audience. So we will use your audience." I stepped around the mahogany desk, forcing him to step back to maintain his balance. The shift in physical power was subtle but undeniable. "I am going to that party, Richard," I promised. "I would not miss your engagement gala for the world. Save me a seat near the projector." Richard stared at me. The venom in his expression was potent, but the underlying terror was brighter. He knew he had lost control of the narrative. He turned around and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the dark corridor. The heavy steel door downstairs slammed shut. I stood alone in the quiet room. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my fingertips buzz. The battle lines were officially drawn. Richard thought he could silence me with fear, but his arrogance only solidified my resolve. The engagement party was no longer just a social event. It was the designated ground for an execution. The countdown to the Hudson Valley Gala had officially begun. The Sterling estate in the Hudson Valley was not merely a home. It was a fortress, built of limestone and glass, designed to remind every visitor of their own insignificance. I handed my car keys to a valet wearing a tailored uniform and stepped onto the sprawling brick courtyard. The crisp evening air carried the scent of roasted duck and imported gardenias. Soft jazz drifted from the open terrace doors. Harrison Sterling did not host simple family gatherings. He staged grand exhibitions of his financial empire, inviting the local press, prominent politicians, and every major real estate developer in the state. I walked through the towering oak double doors and entered the main ballroom. The sheer scale of the event was suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over hundreds of guests dressed in silk and velvet. Waitstaff glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of caviar and towering flutes of vintage champagne. I wore a simple, dark navy dress, standing in stark contrast to the glittering sea of sequins and diamonds around me. My arrival sent a physical ripple through the room. The upstate New York Whisper Network is a highly efficient machine. Within seconds of my foot crossing the threshold, the low murmur of polite conversation near the entrance faded into a tense, sudden silence. Heads turned. Eyes darted toward me, then quickly away. The guests knew the rumors. They knew I was the banished sister, the disgraced appraiser who supposedly robbed her own grandmother. I could feel their judgment pressing against my skin. I did not lower my gaze. I kept my shoulders pulled back and walked deeper into the ballroom. Across the room, standing near a towering 5-tier champagne fountain, I saw them. Jessica wore a bespoke white silk gown that pooled around her feet like liquid pearl. She was the picture of a blushing bride-to-be, but the illusion was brittle. She held her chin high, a frozen smile plastered across her face, but her knuckles were bone white where she gripped Richard's arm. She looked terrified. Richard stood beside her, attempting to project the relaxed confidence of a billionaire heir. He wore a flawless black tuxedo. From a distance, he looked untouchable. But I had seen him sweating in my dark office just 2 days prior. I watched his eyes dart toward the grand entrance, widen as they locked onto me, and then snap toward a pair of private security guards stationed near the catering doors. He raised 2 fingers, delivering a silent command. My role for the evening was simple. I was the shiny object. I had to draw the fire and keep every eye in the room focused on my presence. I needed to create a gravitational pull strong enough to blind them to the perimeter. My mother intercepted me before the security guards could cross the dance floor. Helen materialized from behind an ice sculpture, her face flushed beneath her expensive makeup. She wore an emerald evening gown that rustled sharply as she blocked my path. "What are you doing here?" Helen hissed, her voice a strained whisper meant to evade the ears of the surrounding guests. "I received an invitation, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone light and conversational. I offered her a polite smile, knowing the display of calm would only infuriate her more. "You know you are not welcome," Helen said. She took a step closer, crowding my personal space, trying to force me to step backward. "Richard warned you. You are going to ruin the most important night of your sister's life. You need to turn around and walk out those doors before I have you thrown out." "It is a beautiful venue," I observed, intentionally ignoring her demand. I looked past her shoulder, tracking the 2 security guards in their dark suits. They were navigating through a cluster of local politicians, their eyes fixed firmly on me. The decoy strategy was working perfectly. "Listen to me, Bonnie," Helen warned, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Harrison Sterling is standing 10 feet away. If you cause a scene and humiliate this family in front of his investors, I will never forgive you." "I am not going to cause a scene," I promised softly. "I am just here to watch the slideshow." While I held the center of the room, Aunt Valerie worked the shadows. Valerie understood the architecture of invisible power. During her decades as a corporate auditor, she learned that people rarely question someone who walks with undisputed authority. She did not skulk along the walls or hide behind potted plants. She wore a tailored black blazer and carried a leather portfolio, adopting the exact posture of a senior event coordinator. She walked with purpose down the velvet-roped corridor reserved for the catering staff. Waiters parted to let her through, assuming she was a manager checking the inventory. She bypassed the kitchen entirely and slipped through a side door leading to the elevated mezzanine. The audio-visual control booth sat perched on a balcony overlooking the ballroom. It was a dark, cramped space filled with glowing monitors, heavy mixing boards, and tangled cables. A young technician sat in a rolling chair wearing a black headset and scrolling idly through his phone. Valerie pushed the booth door open and stepped inside. The heavy bass of the ballroom music faded, muffled by the soundproof glass. The technician looked up, startled. He pulled one side of his headset off his ear. "Hey, you are not supposed to be up here. This is a restricted area." Valerie did not hesitate. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. She placed it flat on the edge of his mixing console. She looked down at him with an expression of weary, exasperated professionalism. "The bride is having a minor panic attack in the bridal suite." Valerie lied, her delivery flawless and dripping with corporate exhaustion. "She decided 5 minutes ago that she wants a surprise video file added to the end of the romantic montage. Her mother is driving the catering staff insane. I need 2 minutes on your master terminal to inject the file into the queue." The young technician looked at the $100 bill. He was a gig worker, hired for the night, underpaid, and entirely uninvested in the Sterling family politics. He looked back at Valerie's stern, expectant face. He took the cash and slid his rolling chair back. "Make it fast. The event planner told me to cue the speeches in 5 minutes." "Thank you," Valerie said. She stepped up to the master terminal. She pulled the silver solid-state hard drive from her pocket and plugged the adapter into the primary port. The system recognized the external hardware. A prompt appeared on the glowing monitor. Valerie typed the 2 words we uncovered in the basement study: wait and hope. The security lock dissolved. The high-definition file populated on the screen. Valerie dragged the video directly into the active presentation software, replacing the first slide of the scheduled romantic montage. She set the system to autoplay on the primary cue. The trap was officially armed. The weapon was loaded into the chamber. Valerie stepped away from the console, gave the technician a brief nod of thanks, and walked out of the booth. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and sent a single text message to my number. It contained only a period. Down on the ballroom floor, my phone vibrated against my palm. The green light. The 2 private security guards finally reached my side. They flanked me, their expressions blank and professional. The taller guard leaned in close. "Miss, we have been instructed to escort you off the premises. Please come with us quietly." I looked at the guard, then shifted my gaze to Richard, who was watching the exchange from the head table. I smiled. "You do not want to touch me," I told the guard, my voice carrying clearly over the jazz music. "There are 3 journalists from the city paper standing by the ice sculpture. If you put your hands on me, they will document a physical altercation at a Sterling event. The optics would be a disaster for your employer." The guard hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the press corps. That split second of indecision was all I needed. The overhead chandeliers dimmed, casting a hush over the massive ballroom. The low murmur of conversation evaporated. A single, bright spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the grand stage at the front of the room. The music faded into silence. Harrison Sterling stepped into the light, tapping the microphone. The execution was about to begin. The spotlight hitting the center stage functioned like a physical command. The 2 private security guards who had flanked me only moments before immediately stepped back, dissolving into the shadows of the catering corridor. Nobody moved while the patriarch commanded the room. Harrison Sterling approached the microphone stand with the slow, deliberate stride of an apex predator inspecting his territory. He was a man carved from an era of ruthless acquisitions and hostile corporate takeovers. He wore a traditional midnight black tuxedo that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. Even in his late 60s, he possessed a terrifying, undeniable gravity. Harrison tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed across the vaulted limestone ceiling, silencing any remaining whispers in the ballroom. 200 guests stood paralyzed, their attention anchored entirely to the stage. I took a slow breath, letting the cool glass of my champagne flute rest against my palm. I needed to remain perfectly still. I needed to let the man dig his own grave. "Foundation." Harrison began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the vast space. "That is the singular word I have built my entire life upon. You cannot construct a skyscraper on marshland, and you cannot build a dynasty on deception." He gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Harrison did not inherit his wealth. He started his career sweeping floors in a family hardware store before clawing his way up the Manhattan real estate ladder. He learned the value of a dollar through calloused hands, which bred a profound intolerance for anyone who tried to take shortcuts. He demanded absolute perfection from his investments, his properties, and most importantly, his bloodline. When my son Richard brought Jessica to my office for the first time, I looked for the cracks. Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I look for the structural weaknesses in everything. It is my nature. I look for the hidden flaws that might compromise the Sterling legacy. But I found none." At the head table, Jessica beamed. She sat up straighter, her white silk gown shimmering under the chandelier light. She looked around the room, absorbing the validation. She thought she had conquered the mountain. She thought the most intimidating man in New York had just granted her permanent sanctuary. "Jessica possesses a pristine character," Harrison declared, projecting his voice to the furthest edges of the ballroom. "She understands the value of honesty. She understands that true partnership requires transparency, financial integrity, and a clean family history." The irony was thick enough to choke on. Harrison stood before his most important investors, praising a woman who traded a stolen historical artifact for a counterfeit diamond ring. He was touting the financial integrity of a couple currently drowning in millions of dollars of unregulated street debt. Harrison paused. The silence in the room grew heavy, stretching tight like a piano wire. He turned his head, his piercing gaze tracking across the sea of guests until his eyes locked directly onto me. "Unfortunately," Harrison said, dropping his tone into a low, dangerous register, "we all know that purity is rare. We all know that rot can infect even the strongest foundations if you let the wrong elements through the door. There are individuals who lack the discipline to earn their own keep. There are people who operate in the shadows, coveting what does not belong to them. They will betray their own flesh and blood for a quick payday." The ballroom shifted. It was a subtle, synchronized movement. 200 pairs of eyes followed Harrison's gaze, turning to look at me, standing alone near the ice sculpture. The public shaming was a calculated execution. Jessica had clearly briefed her future father-in-law about the missing sapphire. She had spun the narrative of the jealous criminal appraiser's sister so effectively that Harrison Sterling felt compelled to address the scandal in his speech. He was using his platform to formally exile me from polite society, establishing a protective barrier around his new daughter-in-law. My mother, standing a few yards away, lowered her head, her face burning with secondary embarrassment. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I did not flinch. I did not look away from the stage. I held Harrison's glare with a calm, unblinking focus. I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. Let them stare. Let them judge. The higher they built the pedestal, the more devastating the fall would be. Richard, sitting beside Jessica, was falling apart. While his bride soaked in the praise and his father delivered the righteous condemnation, Richard looked like a man standing on the gallows. His face was slick with a fresh sheen of sweat. He kept pulling at the collar of his bespoke shirt, struggling to draw air into his lungs. He knew I had rejected his non-disclosure agreement. He knew I possessed the silver hard drive. And as he watched me stand confidently under the crushing weight of his father's glare, a terrible realization began to dawn in his eyes. Richard snapped his head toward the elevated mezzanine. He stared at the dark glass of the audiovisual control booth. He was searching for a threat, anticipating an ambush, but he was entirely powerless to stop a moving train. If he interrupted his father's speech, he would draw Harrison's immediate, terrifying wrath. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. "But tonight, we do not focus on the parasites," Harrison announced, his voice booming once again, breaking the tension and pulling the crowd's attention back to the stage. "Tonight, we focus on the future. We celebrate a union built on unquestionable trust. We celebrate my son, a man of impeccable character, and his beautiful new bride." The crowd erupted into polite, measured applause. Harrison raised his hand, gesturing toward the back of the room. "I asked my team to put together a presentation," the patriarch said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "I want to show the world the beauty of this relationship. I want to showcase the memories that brought these two honest souls together. Let us roll the footage." The applause faded into an expectant hush. I lowered my champagne flute. My heart hammered a fierce, relentless rhythm against my ribs, sending hot adrenaline coursing through my veins. I turned my head slightly, looking up toward the elevated balcony. Aunt Valerie stood just outside the control booth door, partially obscured by a velvet curtain. She looked down at the ballroom floor, scanning the crowd until she found me. Valerie gave a single sharp nod. The grand crystal chandeliers above us blinked, then extinguished. The perimeter sconces faded into darkness. The entire Hudson Valley Ballroom was plunged into pitch black, leaving the guests holding their breath in the sudden void. A collective murmur of anticipation rippled through the darkness. They were waiting for the swelling chords of a romantic symphony. They were waiting for a slideshow of sunlit vacations and perfect, curated smiles. The 3 massive 20-foot projection screens suspended from the ceiling flashed awake. They did not display a photograph. They illuminated the room with a stark, blinding white glare before settling into a crisp, high-definition rendering of a dark, wood-paneled room. The surround sound speakers crackled to life. No music played. There were no violins. Instead, a sharp metallic click echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the limestone walls. It was followed by the heavy, distinct grind of a brass dial turning on a steel safe. The 3 20-foot projection screens cast a harsh, white glare across the Hudson Valley Ballroom. The sudden illumination painted the faces of the 200 elite guests in pale, ghostly hues. The string quartet had stopped playing. The room was trapped in a suspended hush. All eyes shifted upward to the high-definition displays. In the bottom right corner of the footage, a digital timestamp pulsed in red numbers. The date read, a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before my grandmother passed away. The frame showed the familiar wood-paneled walls of the upstate Victorian study. The mahogany desk sat empty. The leather armchair rested in the shadows. The image was so crisp, you could see the dust motes dancing in the sunlight filtering through the window. Then, the heavy oak door on the screen creaked open. Jessica stepped into the frame. A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. My mother Helen stood frozen near the catering tables. Her eyes widened as she watched her favorite daughter walk across the projection. On screen, Jessica wore a beige trench coat. Her movements were purposeful. She walked directly to the mahogany wall panel and slid it aside. The high-sensitivity microphone installed by Grandma Rose picked up the metallic grind of the brass dial spinning, followed by the heavy click of the steel safe opening. The real Jessica, standing at the head table in her pristine white silk gown, dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the silent venue, but nobody looked at her. The audience remained entirely captivated by the digital confession unfolding above them. "Always holding on to this stupid thing," Jessica murmured on the video. Her voice piped through the surround sound speakers, filling the vast space with her bitter complaint. "She hoarded this in the dark while I drowned in credit card minimums. It is just sitting here, collecting dust." On the screen, Jessica reached into the steel cavity and pulled out the faded blue velvet box. She snapped the lid open. The antique Edwardian sapphire rested inside. She stared at it, a cruel smirk twisting her features. "Turn it off!" Jessica shrieked in the ballroom. Her voice tore through the real world, shrill and frantic. She lunged forward, her silk gown catching on the leg of a mahogany dining chair. The fabric tore, but she did not stop. She scrambled toward the edge of the stage, waving her arms at the empty darkness above. "Turn the projectors off right now. It is a fake video. Somebody shut it down." Her protests fell on deaf ears. The AV technician was locked outside his own booth. The guests simply stared at her, their expressions morphing from confusion to profound shock. The pristine character Harrison Sterling praised only 2 minutes ago evaporated into thin air. They were watching a calculated theft committed by the blushing bride. But the exposure was only half finished. The audio track on the video captured the sound of heavy, panicked footsteps running down the hallway of the Victorian house. Richard burst into the frame. The real Richard, standing near the towering champagne fountain, turned the color of ash. His jaw dropped. His hands fell to his sides. He watched his own face appear on the towering displays, his bespoke charcoal suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The polished Manhattan air vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified man. "Do you have it?" the digital Richard demanded. He grabbed Jessica by the wrist, pulling the velvet box toward his chest. His voice bounced off the limestone walls of the ballroom, raw and stripped of any practiced charm. Every major real estate investor, every local politician, and every socialite in New York heard the terror vibrating in his words. "I have it," the digital Jessica replied, shrinking against the desk. "But Richard, if the lawyers notice this is missing before the will is read, they will audit the entire estate. We should wait." "We cannot wait," Richard hissed on screen. He crowded her against the wood paneling. The microphone captured every damning syllable. "My father's forensic accountants are reviewing my shell companies tomorrow morning. The private lenders are demanding a payment by midnight. If I do not hand them collateral tonight, they will break my legs. And if my father finds out I borrowed from unregulated street lenders, he will permanently sever my trust. I will lose the family name." The ballroom descended into an icy paralysis. The secret was out. The golden boy of the Sterling dynasty admitted to owing millions to underground debt collectors. He confessed to operating fraudulent shell companies. He openly plotted to defraud his own father's accountants. He was using a stolen family heirloom to pay off a blood debt. Richard snapped out of his frozen stupor. He spun around, his eyes wild with panic. He spotted 2 private security guards standing near the catering corridor. "Get up there," Richard bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. He pointed a shaking finger toward the elevated mezzanine. "Break the door down. Cut the power to the main grid. Shut those screens off." The 4 guards in dark suits sprinted toward the curved staircase. They took the steps 2 at a time, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. They reached the landing and lunged for the handle of the audio-visual control booth. The brass lever refused to budge. The reinforced soundproof door was locked from the inside. One guard threw his shoulder against the thick wood. The door held firm. Through the tinted glass pane, the silhouette of Aunt Valerie stood tall and unmoving. She crossed her arms over her chest, watching the men fail to breach the room. She neutralized the technician and secured the perimeter. She bought me the time I needed to finish the execution. Down on the floor, the social quarantine began. The wealthy investors standing near Richard took a synchronized step backward. The local politicians averted their eyes, mentally calculating how quickly they could distance their campaigns from the Sterling brand. Nobody wanted to stand near a man targeted by loan sharks. His reputation was burning to the ground in real time, and the flames were spreading fast. I stood near the ice sculpture, taking another slow sip of my champagne. The liquid tasted like victory. I looked at my mother. Helen pressed both hands over her mouth, her emerald evening gown trembling as she shook. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She stared at the giant screens, finally watching the undeniable truth. She banished her honest daughter to protect a thief. She threw me into the fire to secure a wealthy future for Jessica, only to discover she traded her legacy for a bankrupt con artist. Harrison Sterling stood at the podium. He did not move a single muscle. He did not yell for security to stop the video. The patriarch stared at the 20-foot projection of his son. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He valued his unblemished legacy above all else. He spent his life building a fortress of financial integrity, and his own blood had just invited the rot inside. The video kept playing. The high-definition camera captured Richard snatching the velvet box from Jessica's hands. It captured him ordering her to wipe her fingerprints from the steel dial. It showed her eager, willing compliance as she polished the brass, actively framing me for the crime she just committed. The trap clamped shut. There were no shadows left for them to hide in. The narrative delivered a deep, visceral satisfaction. I watched my sister and her fiancé drown in the very public venue they chose to host their triumph. The screens dominated the room, and the final fatal plot twist was only seconds away. The digital rendering of the upstate Victorian study held the Hudson Valley Ballroom hostage. High above the paralyzed crowd, the video footage continued its relentless march toward the final fatal truth. The guests watched as the on-screen version of Richard snatched the blue velvet box from Jessica. He issued his sharp command to wipe the steel dial clean. He turned his back on his future bride, walking into the shadowy corner of the room to pull his cellular phone from his trousers. The high-definition microphone embedded in the crown molding picked up the faint rhythmic tones of the keypad. The real Richard, standing near the catering doors, let out a raw, broken sound. It was the noise of a trapped animal, realizing the snare had finally pulled tight. He knew what audio was about to pipe through the surround sound speakers. He knew the illusion was seconds away from a fatal fracture. On the 20-foot screens, the digital Richard pressed the phone to his ear. He cast a paranoid glance over his shoulder to ensure Jessica remained focused on polishing the safe. Then he spoke. "It is Sterling," the digital Richard whispered. His voice was a hurried, frantic scrape. "I have the collateral. I am bringing it to your shop in Manhattan tonight." A muffled, indistinct voice crackled through the tiny earpiece. The person on the other end of the line asked a brief question, likely preparing the secure vault for the incoming historical artifact. Digital Richard covered his mouth with his free hand. He lowered his voice, but the audio sensors caught every single syllable with devastating clarity. "No, do not prep the vault," he murmured into the receiver. "It is a fake. The private appraiser checked the chemical composition yesterday. It is a cubic zirconia replica set in cheap brass. The old lady must have sold the real sapphire decades ago and swapped it with a prop to keep up appearances." The two words bounced off the limestone walls, echoing across the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floor. Cubic zirconia. The transmission ended. The screens faded to a stark, unbroken black. The ballroom was plunged into a silence so profound it felt heavy enough to crush bone. Jessica stopped screaming. The shrill protests that had torn from her throat only moments before died instantly. Her vocal cords snapped shut. She stood near the edge of the stage, the torn hem of her white silk gown pooling around her designer heels. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stopped struggling against the invisible weight of the room and simply stared at the blank screens above her. Her brain processed the audio, calculating the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She had framed her own sister. She had manipulated her grieving mother. She had orchestrated the theft of the most coveted asset in the family trust, believing she was securing her entry into a billionaire dynasty. She traded her flesh and blood for a ticket to the top of the social ladder, and her ticket was a piece of glass. She turned her head slowly, her neck rigid, until her eyes locked onto Richard. Her chest heaved, pulling shallow, ragged breaths. She looked down at her own left hand. The stadium lighting from the stage illuminated the massive engagement ring sitting on her finger. The diamond caught the glare. Suddenly, the stone did not look like a symbol of wealth. It looked like a twin counterfeit. She had sacrificed her entire world for a broke con artist who handed her costume jewelry. The social quarantine around Richard expanded. The wealthy investors, local politicians, and prominent socialites took another synchronized step backward, treating the groom like a biohazard. Nobody wanted to breathe the same air as a man targeted by unregulated street lenders. Poverty and crime were contagious diseases in their world, and Richard was patient zero. Harrison Sterling did not call for the private security guards. He did not ask for the house lights to illuminate the room. The patriarch remained standing in the harsh glare of the single-stage spotlight. He reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hands around the edges of the wooden podium. He leaned into the microphone. A sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the air, making several guests wince. But Harrison did not flinch. His face was a mask of cold, corporate brutality. He was no longer a father hosting an engagement gala. He was a chief executive officer mitigating a catastrophic public relations disaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his tone conversational, but laced with a lethal, icy calm. "When an asset becomes a liability, a prudent investor does not attempt to salvage the wreckage. You isolate the contagion. You cut the loss." He turned his piercing gaze away from the general crowd and focused directly on the front row of tables. He locked eyes with three men sitting in tailored Navy suits. They were the senior board members of the Sterling real estate empire. Martin, David, Elias. Harrison addressed them by name, his voice echoing through the silent venue. "You are witnessing a profound failure of character. My son has admitted to defrauding his own bloodline, operating fraudulent entities, and entangling himself with illicit creditors. He has brought an unacceptable level of risk to our threshold." Richard fell to his knees. His legs gave out, unable to support the weight of the impending execution. He knelt on the polished marble, his hands gripping the lapels of his rumpled tuxedo. He looked up at the stage, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please," Richard begged. His voice was a weak, pathetic whimper. "They will kill me. The lenders will find me. You have to help me cover the principal." Harrison did not look down at his son. He kept his eyes fixed on his board of directors. "Effective immediately," Harrison announced, delivering the final, fatal blow. "I am authorizing the total liquidation of the shell companies operating under the Richard Sterling signature. The accounts are frozen. The corporate shielding is dissolved. Furthermore, the financial trust bearing his name is permanently severed. He receives no severance, no legal protection, and no sanctuary within my properties." The financial execution happened in real time. Harrison stripped the golden boy naked and threw him to the wolves. Richard possessed no money to run, no family to hide behind, and no corporate lawyers to negotiate his survival. The loan sharks waiting in Manhattan would read about the excommunication in the morning papers, and they would come to collect their debt in flesh. He is no longer a Sterling. Harrison finalized, stepping back from the podium. "The engagement is canceled. The party is over. Please locate the valets for your vehicles." The patriarch turned his back on the crowd and walked off the stage, disappearing into the shadows behind the velvet curtains. He left the wreckage behind for the staff to clean up. Richard curled inward, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor. He sobbed openly, a broken, ruined man who tried to bluff a dynasty and lost his life in the process. The guests began to move, swarming toward the coat checks and the grand exit doors, eager to escape the epicenter of the scandal. Jessica stood shivering in her ruined white gown. The glittering future she plotted so ruthlessly to secure had evaporated. She was surrounded by 200 people, yet she had never been more isolated in her entire life. She faced potential criminal charges for grand larceny, even if the stones she stole were worthless. She turned away from the sobbing man on the floor. Her eyes darted frantically through the dispersing crowd until she found the only safety net she had left. Helen stood near the catering tables, her emerald dress standing out against the dark wood paneling. Jessica let out a broken, desperate sob. She stumbled forward, her designer heels catching on the marble. She reached her hand out toward her mother, seeking the unconditional defense she had relied on since childhood. She expected Helen to rush forward to wrap her arms around her favorite child, to shield her from the judging eyes of the departing elite. I remained by the ice sculpture, setting my empty champagne flute onto a passing waiter's silver tray. I watched my sister reach for her salvation, waiting to see if the maternal bond was stronger than the undeniable proof of betrayal. Jessica stumbled across the polished marble floor. The delicate fabric of her bespoke bridal gown snagged under her heel, ripping a jagged seam up the side of her leg. But she did not stop. She propelled herself toward the catering tables, her tear-streaked face locked onto the only sanctuary she had ever known. She reached out her trembling hands, seeking the maternal embrace that had shielded her from every consequence since childhood. Helen stood rigid near a towering floral arrangement. Her emerald evening gown shimmered under the fading perimeter lights. For 30 years, my mother built her entire identity around being the indispensable savior. She married into my father's stoic, wealthy New England family and always felt like an outsider in Grandma Rose's shadow. To compensate, Helen cultivated a toxic enmeshment with her youngest child. Jessica constantly made careless mistakes, overspent her bank accounts, and demanded rescue. Helen provided that rescue, feeding her own ego by playing the eternal protector. She resented my independence because a daughter who pays her own rent and builds her own business does not feed a savior complex. But the savior complex had a strict limit, and that limit was public humiliation. As Jessica closed the final few feet between them, sobbing and reaching for salvation, Helen did the unthinkable. My mother took a distinct, deliberate step backward. The movement was small, perhaps only a few inches, but the psychological chasm it created was vast. Jessica froze in her tracks. Her outstretched hands hovered in the empty air between them. The desperate, pleading expression on her face fractured into something far more pathetic. She looked like a child realizing the safety net had vanished mid-fall. Helen prized social currency above oxygen. She spent her life curating an image of effortless, aristocratic grace. Tonight she watched the most powerful patriarch in New York execute his own son on a lighted stage. She watched 200 elite investors treat the groom like a biohazard. The Sterling dynasty was no longer a golden ticket to high society. It was a burning building, and Jessica was standing in the center of the flames. "Mom," Jessica whispered, her voice a hollow, scraping sound. "Mom, please, you have to help me. He lied to me. Richard lied about everything." Helen stared at the ruin of her favorite daughter. The protective warmth that usually softened her features was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating horror. "You robbed your grandmother," Helen said. Her tone carried no maternal comfort. It was sharp and brittle. "You stole a historical artifact, gave it to a criminal, and then you stood in my kitchen and swore to me that your sister was the thief. You let me throw my own child out of the house to cover your tracks." "I did it for us," Jessica sobbed, dropping to her knees. The torn silk pooled around her on the cold stone. She grasped at the hem of Helen's emerald dress. "I was trying to secure our future. The debt was so high. He promised me we would be taken care of." Helen yanked her dress away, tearing the fabric from Jessica's desperate grip. The physical rejection was brutal. "You traded our reputation for a piece of costume jewelry," Helen hissed, looking around the emptying ballroom to see who was watching them. "You made us an accomplice to fraud in front of every major developer in the state. Do not touch me." The toxic dynamic shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Jessica curled inward, pressing her face against the marble tiles. She wept with the raw, guttural agony of someone who had sacrificed her soul and received nothing in return. She took the ultimate shortcut, seeking an unearned crown, and now she faced a future defined by isolation and impending criminal charges. The grand ballroom rapidly transformed into a ghost town. The high society guests scrambled toward the coat checks, their designer shoes clicking a frantic rhythm toward the exit doors. Outside valets shouted over handheld radios, rushing to retrieve luxury vehicles so the elite could escape the contagion of poverty and scandal. The catering staff moved silently through the room, clearing abandoned champagne flutes and untouched caviar, entirely ignoring the weeping bride on the floor. Helen turned her back on Jessica. She smoothed the front of her gown, her hands shaking violently. She took a deep, shuddering breath and scanned the cavernous room. Her eyes darted past the lingering security guards and the melting ice sculptures until they landed on me. I remained near the perimeter. My posture relaxed. The cold glass of my empty flute rested on a nearby silver tray. I wore a simple navy dress, an outfit chosen for utility rather than spectacle. Yet I was the only person in the venue whose foundation remained intact. The internal calculus shifted behind my mother's eyes. The disgraced, exiled daughter was suddenly the only lifeboat left in the water. Helen realized she had ostracized the only honest person in her bloodline. She had burned the bridge to a daughter who built a legitimate, thriving enterprise through sheer discipline. Helen navigated through the abandoned dining chairs, charting a direct course toward me. Her face contorted into a mask of sudden, desperate remorse. The tears flowing down her cheeks were real, but they were born of self-preservation rather than genuine contrition. She stopped 3 feet away from me. She reached her hands out, mimicking the exact gesture Jessica had used moments before. Bonnie Helen breathed, her voice cracking under the emotional weight of her ruined gamble. "Oh, Bonnie, I am so sorry. I did not know. You have to believe me. She tricked me. She spun such a convincing web, and I was blinded by grief over your grandmother." I did not step backward. I did not need to retreat. My stillness was a far more effective weapon. I looked at the woman who raised me, observing the smeared mascara and the trembling chin. She used my love against me. Helen continued stepping closer, desperate to bridge the distance. She needed absolution. She needed me to validate her victimhood so she could shed the guilt of her own complicity. I was a fool to doubt you. You are my strong girl. You have always been the honest one. We can fix this. We can hire a crisis manager. You can help me navigate the trust attorneys. The apology was entirely transactional. She did not express sorrow for the nights I spent pacing my apartment, terrified of losing my firm. She did not apologize for the whisper campaign that turned my neighbors against me. She was apologizing because she backed the wrong horse, and she needed my steady hands to clean up the mess. I looked into her pleading eyes. For 6 months, I had dreamed of this exact moment. I had imagined the searing vindication of my family dropping to their knees, begging for my forgiveness. I expected the triumph to feel like fireworks, loud and explosive. Instead, the victory felt like ice. It was cold, clear, and perfectly solid. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults or list the grievances she inflicted upon my life. Anger requires emotional investment, and my accounts were permanently closed. Apathy is the ultimate executioner. I maintained a serene, unreadable expression. My silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Helen faltered. Her hands dropped to her sides. She searched my face for a lifeline, for a flicker of daughterly devotion, for a sliver of the obligation that tethers a child to a parent. She found nothing but an empty vault. "Bonnie, please say something," Helen whispered, the panic rising in her throat. She recognized the terrifying finality in my posture. "Do not look at me like that. I am your mother." The power dynamic inverted with a silent, devastating finality. The family that whispered about me in the grocery aisles, the corporate clients that dropped my contracts, and the sister who slandered my name were all left standing in the smoldering wreckage of their own making. I did not need to gloat. My silence was a heavier punishment than any words I could ever speak. Silence acts as a mirror, forcing the guilty to stare at their own hideous reflections. I held her gaze for one long, agonizing minute. I let her feel the precise, crushing weight of my absence. Then I turned my back on her. I walked away from the catering tables, leaving my mother standing alone beside her weeping, ruined favorite child. The grand double doors of the Hudson Valley estate stood open, leading out into the cool, dark New York night, where a new trajectory was waiting to be charted. The dawn broke over upstate New York with a sharp, blinding clarity. The fallout from the Hudson Valley Gala did not wait for the business week to begin. By 8 in the morning, the financial news circuits were already dissecting the implosion of the Sterling heir. Harrison Sterling was a man of his word, and his execution was ruthless. He filed the legal paperwork to dissolve the shell entities before the caterers even finished sweeping up the broken glass. Richard was erased from the corporate registry. Without the protective umbrella of the family name, his underground creditors moved with terrifying speed. They did not send collection notices or file civil suits. They simply seized his remaining liquid assets, his luxury vehicles, and the lease on his Manhattan apartment. Richard vanished into the sprawling concrete labyrinth of the city, a fugitive running from men who traded in broken bones rather than bankruptcy filings. He went from a prominent real estate scion to a hunted ghost in the span of 12 hours. Jessica experienced a different brand of devastation. She was cast out of the social stratosphere and dropped onto cold, unforgiving legal ground. The estate attorneys managing Grandma Rose's trust opened an immediate, rigorous inquiry. Intent to commit fraud is a severe felony in the state of New York. The fact that the sapphire turned out to be a cubic zirconia replica did not shield her from the law. The penal code was unyielding. She bypassed a secured vault, removed an item she believed to be a priceless historical artifact, and handed it to a known debtor to secure personal gain. The local whisper network that once carried her lies now demanded her prosecution. Neighbors who previously offered their congratulations now turned their backs when she walked into a room. She was ostracized, isolated, and staring down the barrel of grand larceny charges. Her bespoke bridal gown was nothing more than torn silk hanging in a dark closet. I sat at my kitchen island sipping dark roast coffee. The apartment was profoundly quiet. The heavy burden of the past 6 months was gone, leaving a startling, weightless peace in its place. The doorbell rang at 9. I did not need to check the peephole to know who was standing in the hallway. I set my mug down on the granite counter and unlocked the door. Helen stood on the welcome mat. She looked physically smaller today, stripped of her aristocratic arrogance. The emerald evening gown was replaced by a wrinkled trench coat. She held a pink cardboard box from the local bakery, offering it forward like a fragile peace treaty. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the skin beneath them puffy from a sleepless night. "I brought croissants," Helen said. Her voice trembled, lacking its usual polished cadence. "The almond ones you always liked." I did not reach for the box. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the crisp air from the corridor drift between us. "You are wasting your time, Mom." "Please, Bonnie," she pleaded. She took a hesitant step forward. She wanted to cross the threshold. She wanted to sit on my sofa, cry into her hands, and let me piece her fractured world back together. "I have not slept a single minute. Jessica will not speak to me. She just sits in her room staring at the wall. The lawyers are calling non-stop, demanding retainer fees I cannot afford. I need my family right now. We need to heal from this tragedy." "It is not a tragedy," I replied, keeping my tone level and precise. "A tragedy is a random act of fate. A hurricane is a tragedy. This was a calculated series of choices. You chose to evict me from the Victorian house. You chose to ignore my warnings in the country club parking lot. You chose a counterfeit diamond over your own blood." Helen lowered the bakery box. A fresh tear spilled over her eyelashes, tracking a slow path down her cheek. I was deceived. She lied to my face every single day. She looked me in the eyes and swore you took it. How was I supposed to know? "Because I told you the truth," I answered. The words landed like heavy stones dropping into a quiet pond. "I gave you my word. I stood in the study and swore to you I did not touch the safe. But my word was not enough for you. You only believed my innocence when a 20-foot high-definition screen forced you to look at it. You required a theater production to validate my integrity." "I am sorry," she sobbed, burying her face in her free hand. Her shoulders shook with the force of her grief. "I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I will do whatever it takes. Just let me come inside." I looked at the woman who raised me. I searched my own chest for a flicker of sympathy. I found no anger, no vindictiveness, and no desire for vengeance. The apathy was profound and unyielding. The maternal tether was cut, and there was no rope left to tie. She chose the daughter who needed saving over the daughter who told the truth, and now she had to live in the wreckage of that choice. "Go home, Mom," I said, gently offering her a final polite dismissal. "Focus on securing a defense attorney for Jessica. She is going to need a very good one." I stepped back into my apartment and closed the door. The latch clicked into place. I turned the brass deadbolt sealing the perimeter. I walked straight to my desk, picked up my phone, and called a local locksmith. By noon, every lock on my front door and my office suite was replaced with high-grade, unpickable cylinders. I severed the toxic root structure permanently. The only family member who retained my new contact information was Aunt Valerie. She earned her place in my life through tactical loyalty and unshakable trust. We were planning a dinner in the city to celebrate a successful audit. The professional rebound was swift and staggering. By Monday morning, the true narrative of the Sterling scandal hit the front pages of the Manhattan financial papers. The journalists detailed Richard's fraudulent shell companies, his unregulated debt, and the dramatic exposure at the engagement gala. The articles highlighted the meticulous detective work of an independent estate appraiser who uncovered the rot. My name was cleared, polished, and elevated to a new tier of prestige. I was no longer the subject of idle gossip. I was a professional who refused to be bullied by a dynasty. At 10 in the morning, my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Thomas Caldwell. The senior partner who terminated my contract mere days ago sounded breathless and eager. He offered profound apologies, blaming his board of directors for the hasty suspension. He praised my resilience and begged me to return to the Kensington Estate project, promising a seamless transition. I listened to his groveling apology while polishing my jeweler's loop with a microfiber cloth. "I am available to take the Kensington contract, Thomas," I said, my voice projecting a cool, undisputed authority. "But the landscape has changed. My consulting fee has increased by 40%, and I require a non-refundable retainer wired to my operating account by the end of the business day. If you meet those terms, I will send over the revised addendums." He agreed without a single moment of hesitation. The power dynamic within my industry shifted permanently. I was no longer a small-town appraiser fighting for scraps at the bottom of the ladder. I was the woman who outsmarted a real estate heir and lived to tell the tale. The corporate liquidation agencies recognized my unshakable integrity, and they were willing to pay a premium to associate their brands with my name. I packed my leather appraisal kit, securing the brass latches with a satisfying snap. I carried the heavy case down the wooden staircase and walked out into the crisp, bright New York afternoon. I placed the kit on the passenger seat of my car and started the engine. The dashboard hummed to life. I pulled out of the gravel parking lot, merging onto the open highway leading south toward the Hamptons. The sun warmed the windshield. The road ahead stretched out clear and unburdened by the expectations of people who never understood my value. I left the wreckage of my past in the rearview mirror, driving toward a future built entirely on my own terms. My family demanded my expertise. They wanted me to appraise the estate, to evaluate the worth of our shared history, and to settle the ledgers of our bloodline. I did exactly what they asked. I appraised the family, and I found it entirely worthless. There is a profound, echoing silence that follows the collapse of a family. It is not the sudden, deafening quiet of a house after an argument, but a slow, creeping stillness, the kind that settles into the floorboards when you realize the people you loved were merely playing roles in a script you never agreed to read. The story of Bonnie Jones, the missing sapphire, and the ruined Hudson Valley Gala is more than a thrilling chronicle of vindication. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and the shattered crystal lies a devastating cautionary reflection on the architecture of parenthood, the burden of family responsibility, and the quiet tragedies we author when we fail to guide our children toward the truth. In the landscape of American culture, the traditional family structure is often romanticized as an impenetrable fortress. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, that loyalty is the highest virtue, and that a mother's love is an unconditional sanctuary. Yet what happens when that sanctuary is built on a foundation of willful blindness? Helen, the matriarch, who banished her honest daughter to protect a thief, represents the darkest manifestation of the parental savior complex. Her failure was not a sudden lapse in judgment born of grief. It was the culmination of decades of tiny, incremental choices where emotional awareness was traded for the illusion of control. Parenting requires the delicate, agonizing balance of fostering fierce independence while providing a safe harbor. We want our children to soar, yet the human ego often yearns to be needed. Helen confused her daughter's dependency with devotion. Every time Jessica made a reckless choice, overspent a bank account, or demanded a rescue, Helen was there, armed with a checkbook and a ready excuse. Jessica's helplessness became the currency with which she purchased her mother's affection. Conversely, Bonnie's self-sufficiency became a threat. A child who pays her own rent, builds her own business, and navigates the world without asking for a life raft does not feed a parent's need to be a savior. In a healthy family dynamic, Bonnie's unshakable integrity would be celebrated as the ultimate parenting success. But in a toxic structure, independence is viewed as an act of defiance. Helen penalized Bonnie for not needing to be saved, creating a skewed domestic economy where fairness was abandoned and truth was treated as an inconvenience. This dynamic reveals a critical lesson about long-term guidance. Teaching children the value of honesty is not accomplished through lectures. It is demonstrated through accountability. When we shield our children from the consequences of their actions, we are not protecting them. we are disarming them. We strip them of the emotional resilience required to navigate a world that does not care about their last name. By constantly running interference for Jessica, Helen cultivated a profound moral fragility in her favorite child. She taught Jessica that shortcuts were acceptable, that appearances held more weight than reality, and that other people, even her own sister, were merely stepping stones, or collateral damage on the path to maintaining a facade. The heirloom sapphire serves as the perfect, heartbreaking metaphor for the values instilled in this family. Grandma Rose's necklace was coveted as a symbol of aristocratic prestige and deep-rooted legacy. Jessica sacrificed her family, her sister's career, and her own soul to steal it, hoping to buy her way into the glittering, untouchable world of the Sterling dynasty. But the jewel was a cubic zirconia, a flawless, worthless fake. How many of us spend our lives chasing cubic zirconia values? We push our children toward markers of success that look dazzling on the surface: wealth, elite marriages, high society approval, while ignoring the chemical composition of their character. Richard Sterling looked like a billionaire heir, impeccably tailored and dripping with old money charm. Yet he was hollow inside, drowning in debt and driven by cowardice. Jessica chose the counterfeit man because she was raised to value the counterfeit life. When parents fail to instill an authentic moral compass, their children will inevitably navigate toward the brightest, cheapest light in the room. Family responsibility demands more than just providing food, shelter, and college tuition. It demands the courage to look at our children clearly, to see their flaws without looking away, and to love them enough to tell them the word no. True emotional awareness in raising a family means recognizing when our desire to help crosses the line into enabling destruction. If Helen had possessed the emotional fortitude to demand the truth in that wood-paneled study, the entire tragedy could have been averted. Instead, she chose the comfort of a familiar lie over the sharp, necessary pain of an ugly reality. She chose to throw her honest daughter to the wolves, only to discover that the wolf was already wearing her favorite daughter's designer coat. If you have ever felt the isolating weight of being the strong one, if you have ever been the daughter or son who walked away from a burning table to save your own peace, you are not alone. There is a quiet strength in building your own foundation when the one you were born into crumbles. For more stories exploring the complex, often hidden dynamics of family, betrayal, survival, and the ultimate pursuit of truth, I encourage you to subscribe to Linda Vengeance. Join our community, share your experiences in the comments, and walk alongside those who know that the greatest revenge is a life lived with unshakable integrity. In the end, the story leaves us standing in front of a mirror, examining the reflections we pass down to the next generation. We must ask ourselves what ledgers we are keeping in the dark corners of our own homes. Are we raising children who know how to stand firmly on their own 2 feet, anchored by honesty and fairness? Or are we handing them polished pieces of glass, telling them it is diamonds, and sending them out into a world that will inevitably test the stone? The answers do not reside in the grand, sweeping gestures of our lives. They are found in the quiet, split-second choices we make when the safe is empty, the door swings open, and we must decide who we are truly willing to protect. Sometimes the most terrifying realization is not that the people we love are capable of betrayal, but that the seeds of that betrayal were planted, watered, and nurtured in the very soil we called home.